Now we're ready to talk about the music of life and the idea that organisms are songs, and resonance is an organizing force that provides the upward and downward causation that we're looking for. So the music of life is an old metaphor where it has many associations. There's just the idea of intricacy, that there are many things working together like the parts of an orchestra, and each part knows their role such that collectively they're more than the sum of the parts. There's the idea of an abstract pattern, a musical score that gets played out over time, an unfolding of the score into the actual music. There are the associations of symphony and beauty and art that are emotive, that are about self-expression. There's ideas about things being unfolding according to a plan, that they're following a score that's written by a composer. And conversely, there's the idea of sort of improvisation or jazz, that there are sort of rules or constraints, but what happens in it is fundamentally creative. There's also a notion of things being properly alive, that they're not machine-like, they're not scripted, but they take on a life of their own, that music imbues things with spirit. And beyond organisms and life, the role of music in the nature of the universe, the music of the spheres, physical matter is music solidified, said Pythagoras, and there's the idea of music reaching into the soul of the universe. That's a lot of metaphorical associations with the music of life. Which ones of those we want to keep and which ones do we not? Matthew Segal again says, a better analogy or metaphor for what an organism is, instead of an organism as a machine with replaceable parts and so on that can be understood just as a freeze frame, instead an organism is more like a song, and the genetic code would be the musical score and the cells are like the orchestra, but not like a musical score, because one difference in this analogy is that in the case of a cellular orchestra, they're building their own instruments as they go. I would say they're making up their own music as they go as well. Dennis Noble puts it that organisms orchestrate the activity of their genes to suit their purposes. I'm thinking about those self-referential homeostatic loops at multiple levels and the downward causation that's involved, such that there's a feedback between what they are, what they do, and how they come to be. That those things are all intertwined with one another. That's the sort of territory of music that I'm looking for. I don't think it's just a metaphor. I'm talking about an information-laden causal process. I'm going to use the word song rather than music so that I can hold on to which metaphorical associations I want and refine it a little bit. And it has a physical dimension to it, that it's about what matter does and how matter works. It has an abstract dimension to it, that it's a pattern and an organizing principle. It has an algorithmic notion to it, that it's a cognitive algorithm with problem-solving competence. And it's properly causal, not just physical in the sense of that's what it is, but it makes things happen. An organizing force, top down and bottom up. And it describes a feedback between process and structure, between program and data, between a material ontology and a processual ontology. I also prefer the word song, or at least I'm using it this way, because it's more like self-expression than a symphony. In other words, it's not music that's written by a composer and performed by an orchestra. It's more like a self-actualizing, self-realizing, making its own way, making itself sort of musical metaphor. Not just a metaphor. There's no such thing as just a metaphor, is there? Okay. So living things are songs. They're homeostatic dynamics at all physical and temporal scales, organic, cellular, molecular, linked together harmonically. That multi-scale interlocked pattern is the song of the organism. It's a cognitive thing at all levels, describing memory, learning, adaptive plasticity, problem-solving competency. And the organismic song orchestrates the activity of the genes and their evolution. Songs are algorithms of adaptation that orchestrate evolution. This is a cognition-first theory of life. Well, that's quite a lot to take in, so let's break it down a bit. Let's first do the relationship between songs and the physiology, the physical form of an organism. So we know that slow frequencies reside in large physical scales, and fast frequencies reside in small physical scales. The dynamics can be resonant dynamics in any substrate. They don't have to be in the audible range, vibrations in air. They can be feedbacks that are homeostatic at all scales and in any substrate. And organisms have all sorts of homeostatic feedbacks at all scales. Homeostatic means a self-sustaining dynamic, right? A resonance. So bioelectric patterns in tissues, cell signaling feedbacks between cells, gene regulatory attractors within cells, all of those things are substrates which are relevant. Okay, so how do we get between forms and songs? So first, the top down. Forms have songs. Shape and forms determine songs. The macroscale shape and geometry of an object determines the frequencies that they generate or resonate to, whether that's the size of a tuning fork or the length of a string or the position of masses on the string or the shape of a drum skin. By the way, the string vibrating with the masses on it does remind me somewhat of the different geometries of the chromosomes can take. And we sort of know that this is the case because the different organismic morphologies have characteristic vibration spectra. The bioelectric waves on the head end of the planaria is different from the bioelectric waves on the tail end of the planaria. Okay, what about bottom up? Can songs make forms? Well, you can detect the geometry that matches the frequency. If you have a telescopic pipe and you put a loudspeaker at the end playing a particular tone, then you can extend the pipe until you find the length that resonates to that tone. But usually you can't get the sound to actually move stuff, right? Because, stuff is rigid. But if the shape is fluid, then, I've put the video on top of the other pictures by mistake. If the shape is fluid, then the shape can be actually modified by the sound. On the left is droplets of blue micellar water on olive oil in a Tupperware on a speaker in my kitchen. And when the speaker's not on, they're just droplets of water. But if you vibrate the olive oil at a frequency which causes the water to resonate, but not the oil, then you create standing waves in the water. But standing waves want to fit in a geometry that has an integer number of wavelengths in the length or width of the shape. And that can't be true for a round droplet. So the resonant waves in the water change the shape of the droplet in order to fit an integer number of wavelengths into that shape. Turns out the easiest way to do that is to make a worm 1 wavelength wide and n wavelengths long. The droplets change shape until they find the shape and form that resonates or fits to the song that they're singing. If you want to see this in a single water droplet resonated by sound, you can then resonate the water droplet to the second harmonic and the third harmonic and so on, changing the shape of the water droplet to fit the waves that you're resonating in that object. Isn't that cool? I love that. So the idea is, what if tissues of an organism grow until they find the shape and form that they resonate to? What if that's how this works? That the cells are singing a little song that has a frequency that resonates in a diameter of a particular size. And when that song finds that resonance, it knows that it's reached the target morphology. If you had a bioelectric wave that was created at a cell surface, and that wave modified the bioelectric potential on the neighboring cell, and that cell modified the first one, now you'd have a little circuit that goes from one cell to its neighboring cell. But if by the time it comes back, it's not in phase, it will produce stress in both of those waves, both of those cells. And if you were to elongate the tissue, you would find eventually a wavelength like a guitar string that's the right length for the frequency that you're playing instead of the other way around. The guitar string determines the frequency that's played. The frequency determines the length of the guitar string. So the tissue grows until it finds a resonant frequency. That's the idea. It's just an idea. You sort of know that it's true, though, because the song produces the characteristic morphologies. When you take the bioelectric pattern from the head end and you write it onto the tail end, it transforms the tissue into the head shape. let's look at the shape and form of particular intervals. So one tone is just a sine wave. Two tones together is an interval. If they're different frequencies, different combinations of frequencies, like 1 to 1 is a single tone, 1 to 2 is an octave. And you can draw out the trajectory of that relationship as a Lissajous pattern. So they are two-dimensional projections of a waveform decomposing the waveform back into two components. And if those components are composed of two frequencies in a harmonic relationship, like 2 to 1 or 2 to 3, in other words, a rational number, then you get a stationary pattern. You can demo this with a pendulum that has a different natural frequency in the X than it does in the Y. There's a clever mechanical trick to do that. And it will draw out the Lissajous pattern, the one that I've circled in yellow there. So there's an idea here of a nice harmonic flowing pattern in a high dimensional space projected down into a low dimensional space creates all sorts of interesting complexity. This is a higher order Lissajous pattern. A complicated 2D thing can be a projection of a simple n-dimensional thing. If the pattern is built from two frequencies and a harmonic ratio, then the two-dimensional projection is stationary. If the two frequencies are not in harmonic relationship, but almost, then you get a pattern that rotates slowly in the third dimension. And if it's a higher dimensional shape, then it changes shape as it rotates. It transforms through time as well as just rotating through time. And those lower dimensional trajectories can be transiently pseudo-stationary. And then you can see the factors. You can see the Fourier decomposition coming into and out of coherence as phase difference stabilizes and then destabilizes again. What the hell are you talking about? Well, here's a demo that I did by just adding up lots of cosines of different frequencies and compiling them on, summing them on top of one another. And when you do that and you project it back into that one-dimensional space and project it into a two-dimensional space, you can turn it into a movie. Here's the movie of that waveform unfolding over time. It doesn't mean anything. It was just an arbitrary collection of waves. So it's not just shape and form, but also behavior. And then collapsing back down to the seed from which it started because the wave has to be symmetric. Coincidence that it looks a bit like an organism with a tail? Let's just say that it's coincidence. What if all biological structure was music solidified, as Pythagoras said? Here's an example of protein-gene interaction and interactions within a cell, interactions between cells of a developing embryo, which looks remarkably like a tuning fork, determining the segmentation of the body and how the different components modify one another's phase in order to create slightly different components as you move along the vertebrae. So those are the ideas that link songs to physical shape and form. What about the ideas that link songs to genetics? So now we need to go top down from songs to microscale structure. These are Chladni plates. Each square is a square metal plate supported on a central post. When you vibrate the plate at a particular frequency, it will cause standing waves in the plate if the frequency is a harmonic of the plate. And if you sprinkle sand or salt onto the plate, it gets jiggled around by the vibrations in the plate. But not just jiggled around arbitrarily, it gets jiggled around in a particular way. Specifically, if it's on a part of the plate which is moving up and down rapidly, then it gets exploded away. But if it's on a part of the plate that's on a point of inflection, the zero crossing point in the node in the wave, then it's not tossed around and it stays still. So the sand is moved onto the nodal lines in the two-dimensional geometry, and you're in a sense seeing a cross-section through the waveform of the two-dimensional waveform. No, you're seeing a two-dimensional cross-section of a three-dimensional waveform, the song that the plate is singing, captured in a low-dimensional projection. Notice that the stress is created in grains that are not on the nodal lines, and when they are therefore moved to accommodate to the song that the plate is singing. Oh, those are ones that I did in my kitchen. They're not as neat as the ones from the Wikipedia page. Now, when you look at the small scale, it looks a bit like a variation and selection process. If you look at the microscale, a grain is in a position that's either selected against or selected for. Selected for means it can stay still. Selected against means it's pinged off. And the pinging off seems random, right? It goes in any direction from there. But if you stand back a little bit and look at it at arm's length, it looks transformational. It's almost a direct induction, right? As you move to a particular frequency, the sand just moves into the next pattern, and you change to the next resonant frequency and the sand just moves into the next pattern. It looks transformational, even though at the microscopic scale, it looks like variation and selection. The response of random variation in an organized selective field, right? So the grains are moving randomly, but the selective field is not random, it's organized, and that moves the grains into particular positions. In fact, it's not just that it's random variation with an organized selective field, it actually invokes the variation where it's needed. It's not that the grains that are on the nodal lines are, they aren't varying randomly. There isn't any mutation in the grains which are on the nodal lines. They're left alone. It's the grains which are in the oscillating parts of the plate where variation is induced. Now, as presented, the grains don't alter the mode of the plate. They're just a way of reading the mode of the plate, like your tea leaves, perhaps. But if the grains were heavier, or they attracted other deposits that were heavier, then their position would affect the natural mode of the plate. They would be a sort of a record of the mode that could be played back. If I glued the sand down, sprayed it with glue, and added lots of layers to it, then I could ping the plate, and I would get back the frequency that had produced that pattern. The pattern would be a recording of that mode. It isn't a full recording, though. It doesn't define the phase of the song because it was only a two-dimensional cross-section. They only record the zero crossings, like a cross-section, a lower dimensional projection, not the whole waveform. It doesn't have the phase or the amplitude. It only has the zero crossing points. So it isn't a complete reconstruction or playback. It's more like the sort of checkpoints for the waveform. So here's a story about how songs can influence DNA. What if cellular songs in gene regulatory activity, cytoskeletal vibrations, all the chromatin marks and their vibrations with one another, what if that cellular song organized gene activity like vibration organizes the sand of the Chladni plate? We know that the gene activity, regulatory activity inside a cell is not a static pattern. It's not a feed-forward process that just says, genes get transcribed and translated into proteins and that's it. It's a dynamic system of self-sustaining feedbacks. Now, those feedbacks are going to interfere with their own operation or on others that they're coupled with and experience stress, which forces them into behaviors which have phases that interfere less. So they're going to be resonant feedbacks, not just feedbacks. And those resonant patterns of gene activity move the sand. They move the material on the recording plate, the DNA molecule. For example, moving the methylation marks on the DNA. What if methylation was just something which happened everywhere on the DNA, but when the gene activity caused by the cell transcribed and translated that bit of gene activity, it threw off the methylation marks, such that the methylation that was on genes that weren't active stayed still, and the methylation that was on genes that were active was thrown off, so that the methylation is an imprint of the gene activity, not the other way around. It's not that the genes that are methylated don't get read, it's that the genes that aren't being read stay methylated. Then the methylation marks would experience modified selection, that if you had a genetic change that occurred in a gene that was methylated, then it wouldn't matter because the gene wasn't being expressed anyway. But if a mutation occurred in a gene that wasn't methylated, then that would matter and it would be selected against. So the methylated changes would then be induced into the genetic changes over evolutionary time, so that the song that the cell is singing would orchestrate the selective field that directs genetic evolution. We have some components of that environmentally induced DNA methylation is inherited across generations in a way that doesn't depend on the methylation marks being inherited. It's reproduced in multiple generations. And the Baldwin effect takes care of canalizing the methylation patterns into the DNA. This gives us a way of doing phenotype first evolution, that the cellular activity, the organismic activity in the cells, is directing the genetic evolution down at the lower level. Because genomes are read-write dynamical attractors, are they? Yeah, you know they are, because they have error correction and repair dynamics, right? It's not just that you copy DNA like a crystal, you have to copy it in a rubbishy way, and then all sorts of cellular machinery corrects all of the genetic information to remove errors, right? So it's a dynamic process of creating a sustained genotype that travels through time. Those read-write dynamics are complicated. They change the DNA, not just put it back exactly as it were. It's not just a case of copying one strand to the other. And Eigen's paradox about the idea that the smallest bit of DNA that could code for a protein that could do DNA repair is longer than you could copy without that DNA repair. So it has to be a kind of hypercycle process, a multi-scale feedback loop that creates that fidelity. Now, if you have a multi-scale feedback loop that creates that kind of fidelity, you would expect there to be resonance between higher level homeostatic loops and lower level gene editing loops. That would be possible. And that would mean that you'd see things like organization of chromosomal domains that corresponded to the organization of morphological domains. Chromosomal domains, as you're reading along the strand, would be records of the activity that was happening at that moment in time that you wrote, like a needle on vinyl, a needle on wax that's recording it, not a needle on vinyl that's reading it. But, you know, it's both. Maybe that helps explain the ordering of Hox genes and homeobox genes, that they're in the same order as their expression along the vertebrae. Consider that linear alignment as being a sort of resonance between one scale of organization and another, which would make sense if they were resonant coupled both ways, and doesn't make sense if they're not. If you have that kind of coupling back and forth, then perhaps there's the possibility of including a dynamical process that's involved in the error correction. Now we're getting to the scale where it isn't just creating a selective field which organizes random variation and selection, but it can actually invoke variation in the points where variation is needed, like it moves the sand where it needs to move and it doesn't move the sand where it doesn't. That if you had a stutter or a change in the state whilst you were reading this gene, you would get more changes occurring than when you're doing that one, you didn't get a stutter. Okay, so those are the ideas which connect songs to organisms, their physiology and behavior, and genes, their expression and evolution. If the organismic activity can change the activity of the genes, then it can change the selective consequences of genetic variation and thereby orchestrate genetic change. In other words, songs orchestrate evolution. Okay, so what exactly do I mean by a song? Well, like I said, it's the physical thing, the behavior of a physical dynamical system with components oscillating in harmonic relationships with top-down and bottom-up communication. It's also the pattern, the abstract mathematical pattern and structure of those relationships that's sort of substrate independent and scale invariant. But it's also a cause. It's the capability of those abstract patterns to create or organize physical matter such that it sings that song. And it's also an algorithm. It's program and data, an adaptive correlation learning algorithm that learns to solve problems better with experience. I'm going to talk about deep optimization soon. That's what I mean by a song being an information-laden causal dynamical pattern that is self-sustaining, self-correcting, self-propagating, scale invariant, substrate independent. What's the difference between a song and some dynamics? The difference between some dynamics and a song is harmonic ratios that link dynamics together between different scales, such that causes at a particular scale are semi-independent of other scales, but there's also communication between scales, top down and bottom up. Let me say a little bit more about how that works. So when you have two oscillators that are the same frequency, they exchange energy between one another quite powerfully and will exhibit phase locking, like the metronomes on the wobbly board or Huygens' original pendulum clocks on a shared wall or beam. The dynamics of one oscillator will interact most strongly with other oscillators that have the same frequency. The pendulum of the same length resonates to the pendulum of the driver. And that means that it's a causal process that properly belongs to a given physical scale, because frequency and physical scale go together for a given medium. It's almost entirely independent of the physical scale above and below, comma, but it isn't entirely independent because there's communication between levels. This is the harmonic resonance, like the harmonic rotary resonance of the moons of Jupiter, but also harmonic frequencies between physical materials, physical frequencies like one pendulum of twice the length of the other or a metronome of twice the frequency in other. They also lock. It's called subharmonic injection locking. And the dynamics at different scales therefore lock together. Successive octaves lock from the fundamental frequency to an octave up 2 times the frequency, the next octave 4 times the next octave, 8 times the fundamental frequency, and also at other harmonic ratios like the 2-to-3 ratio, the perfect fifth. Now that locking, though, is underdetermined. There are 2 ways to lock the fast frequency to the slow frequency, like this and like this, right? There are 2 different ways to lock the fast frequency onto the slow frequency. That's the underdetermination that we need. The phase locking within and between scales is what makes it one system. That's what makes it a song and not just a bag of dynamics. Which oscillator is in control? When the 2 metronomes are the same frequency, it's obvious that neither one of them is the master nor the slave. It's not metronome A pushing metronome B, and metronome B is just doing what it's told. They are in a mutual joint behavior. And that's also true in the subharmonic locking as well. It's neither the small fast metronome nor the large slow metronome that is the master or the slave. Their joint behavior is mutually locked. So neither the macro scale nor the micro scale is in charge. No scale is privileged in the causal flow upwards or downwards. Okay, how do songs reproduce or get inherited from one material to another? Well, we already saw the idea of a driving pendulum resonating another pendulum that has the same natural frequency. This is a transmission and reception concept. It's basically how wireless communication works. You can do it in sound as well. You can do it in electricity. It doesn't matter what substrate you do it in. It's not just about one tone, though, or one frequency. You can also read the waveform by observing one continuous variable in a complex system with many internal hidden state and reconstruct that system with the same internal architecture by induction from that waveform. Or here's a nice example. How do snowflakes have that 6-fold symmetry? How does one branch of the snowflake, if I isolate one of them and the one that's opposite, know what the other branch of the snowflake is doing? How is the geometry read from one side and written to the other? Well, the first answer might be, well, it's all intrinsic differences in the seed. The initial water molecule that began the snowflake was different in some way, and that created a crystalline structure which had to grow that way in both directions and on all of the arms. Answer 2, communication through vibration of the water molecules as they crystallize, which would require induction because they're going to move through that central branch, which they're not directly in contact with one another. They're not literally folded over. But successful induction from one arm to the other arm would require that the dynamic pattern can be induced, right? It goes through that low-dimensional interface and out the other side and reconstructs the same geometric pattern. They mutually define and construct one another. And that would only be possible if they spoke the same language, the language of the 6-fold geometry of the water atoms. But the song that they're singing can be transferred in that language because they have the suitable inductive bias to do so. Maybe that helps us understand how songs can be substrate and scale independent. The same song can be held in any substrate and in any pitch. I can play the same tune on a different instrument. I can play the same tune an octave further up the same instrument. And it can be transferred from one substrate to another and held over time. For example, gene regulatory dynamics could be transferred to metabolic dynamics, could be transferred to bioelectric patterns and back again. The bioelectric activity in waves in the modified antler could change the song that gene regulatory dynamics are playing within all of the cells, including the cells in the growth plate of the skull and back again in the next season. So answer one to why is the shape of the antler the way that it is because it's in the seed, that the growth plate of the skull and the genetics therein determines the shape that it can be. It's the only way that it could be. But answer two is that the antler is made up as it goes along from a language of possible antler shapes that mutually define and construct one another. Well, how would you know that that was the case? How can you tell whether it's in the seed or whether it's a mutual co-construction? Well, you could tell because if you modified one of them, it would be transferred. You would have the variation between left and right would be the variation between one organism and another would still be maintained symmetrically between left and right within one organism. And also, it could be transferred through time, that a modification to the morphology of one season would be transferred through time to another season. That's how you know it's not determined in the seed. Singing, the verb, is something we need to look into. It's an active organizing dynamic. Singing transforms the singer. The dynamics produce the organization. It organizes physical materials and changes their shape and form by attracting them into harmony. Imagine a wobbly board with 10 metronomes on it, all of which were at the same frequency, but one was a little bit off. They would phase lock that one and bring it back into line. They would bring it back into harmony. The action of bringing into harmony, harmonization, removes discord from the system. It's a kind of error correction. It's related, I think, to the idea of least rattling that Jeremy England's been talking about recently, or dissipative adaptation that doesn't require selection, right? So error correction, pseudo-digital self-organization comes for free in harmonics. It's an active error correction process that's sort of combinatorial, sort of pseudo-digital, like this frequency resonates and this frequency doesn't, but this frequency does, and double again does. So it's pseudo-digital with big spaces in between. When you have a system that has a large number of possible messages with big gaps in between, with a dynamics that pushes you towards valid messages, that's what you need for error correction. And singing the song, repetition, amplifies and clarifies the song. The stress or discord which is in the song produces directed energy that reorganizes the material to remove that stress or discord. Harmonization removes noise or stress of discord towards a consensus to remove defects. So harmony is a pattern, a mathematical relationship or organization about how, the 2-3 of the perfect fifth. But harmonization is a physical causal process that resonance changes organization, changes the strength of connections between things. So harmony and harmonization are product and process. Songs are matter programs that self-correct and self-propagate in a scale-invariant, substrate-independent way. Does all matter do this? What's inanimate matter? Well, if matter is naturally programmable by resonance at all scales, then that means that you can hum to it at the right frequency and change it. That's what an MRI machine does, right? You vibrate the water molecules and you can speak directly to the water molecules inside throughout the body without having to go through a destructive way of deconstructing the macro scale structure of the organism, thankfully. But if the scales are not harmonically linked, you won't see any effects on other scales. I can vibrate the water, but it doesn't change the other internal structures of the cell or the cell shape or the organs or anything else that's going on in the organism. But if they are in multi-scale homeostatic dynamics that are harmonically linked, then changing one scale does have leakage to other scales. The things which are twice the frequency and 4 times the frequency and 8 times the frequency will also resonate. Those are the overtones of the fundamental. So the reverse engineering problem at each level is shallow, given the autonomy of the units below, but you get the harmony all the way up and all the way down. And when there are big gaps in scale, that you've got this frequency and then you've got this massive frequency way up here, the matter is going to be inanimate, that you don't get that kind of leakage. But when there are lots of small steps moving through harmonic relationships that are individually reversible, then the matter is animate. You have that coupling upwards and downwards that turns it into the kind of physical dynamical process that can be responsive, that can take in information, do information integration, and do collective action. I haven't shown you how yet. That is characteristic of being animate as opposed to just being inanimate like a brick. So harmony comes from conditioning, if but only if the environment conditions it, that harmonizes the material. If the environment speaks its language and is patient, sings to it in a language that it understands, then it creates harmonization in that material. This is what Mike would call persuasion, that you're not just shoving it in amplitude space. When I shove my laptop, it moves the molecule that I touch with my finger, which moves the molecule that's inside the laptop, that moves all the other molecules that are inside the laptop, and all scales change. The macro scale, the components inside, the wiring inside that, the little gates inside that, the electrons inside the gates, they all get shoved. But when you talk to something in a frequency, you can talk to one scale without touching the other scales, as though you can modify components at the micro scale without shoving things at the macro scale. But of course, you don't just want to move things at the micro scale that doesn't have any effect on the macro scale. You want to persuade the macro scale to do something. What you mean by persuading the macro scale to do something is that I'm not going to shove the macro scale. I'm going to talk to the micro scale, and the micro scale is going to talk to the mesoscale, and the mesoscale is going to talk to the macro scale, and that will make the macro scale do it. But it'll do it in a way which maintains the integrity of the system without just deforming it. Okay, how do we explain the relationship between phenotypes and genotypes? It is the case that organisms in a population have a pretty strong correlation between ones with this genes look like that, ones with those genes look like that. How do you explain that correlation? Well, the traditional way to explain that correlation is because genes cause phenotypes, that genetic evolution is where the action is, and development and phenotypes don't really matter. They're sort of like a side branch, really, almost an epiphenomena of genetic evolution. The conventional interpretation is that inherited genes control phenes, and that's why phenotypes are correlated with genotypes. But if you have downward causation, you can completely turn that on its head if you want to. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can. You could say, what if this phenotype gets transferred over time from one organism to the other, but changes in the phenotype over time get pushed down into changes in the genes? You would still see a correspondence between phenotypes and genotypes, but the causal process would be the other way. Phenotypic evolution would be where the action is, and the induction of genetic patterns in genes wouldn't really matter. Now, I don't think either of those stories is true, but my point in presenting the second one is to offer a contrast to the extreme view of the conventional interpretation. I think a more appropriate view is that inheritance works through resonance transmission of a song, not just the genes, and not just the phenotype either. That song is a dynamical process in all of the architecture of the organism, which gets passed through a low-dimensional projection and then back up, expanded into an organism in the next generation. And all of the different parts of the machinery which get materially transferred, whether that's the genetic material or the small mRNAs or the cytoplasm of the cell or the uterine environment or the parental effects, all of that is part of the song that gets transferred to the next generation. Because genes and phenes and everything in between cause genes and phenes and everything in between. They are part of an ongoing process. It's the singing of the song that's transferred, carried by all of the materials at all of the scales, inside and outside the organism. And DNA replication is part of that song. It transfers the traces that the song leaves behind in the sand, the zero crossings, but it isn't the whole song. In fact, maybe the evolutionary lineage is one continuing and ongoing song. It's not that here's the song and now we've copied it into this material and now we've copied it into that material, but it's one song that's ongoing. And each organism is a variation on a theme, an instance, a particular instantiation of that song in physical material. The variation that would be induced by interaction with the environment and the response to the environment would then not be intrinsically dependent on microscopic variation and selection happening entirely at the genetic level. So in contrasting a gene's eye view and a song's eye view, genes suggest that the lowest level only contain all the design information and are in charge of organizing all the higher levels in a bottom-up way. And linkages between levels are one-way substrate-specific mechanisms designed for the purpose of making such linkages. But songs suggest that all levels contain self-sustaining design information, and each level organizes itself autonomously and communicates with levels above in a bottom-up way, as conventional, but also below in a top-down way. And linkages between levels are bidirectional. And the linkages, those linkages are the inevitable result of resonance, interference, and stress reduction. They don't need to be designed. If you have a dynamics in a bioelectric wave and you have a dynamics in a gene regulatory network, you don't need to design the linkage between the gene regulation network and the bioelectric waves. If there's any coupling between them, they will organize themselves so that they link. They will find, if they have a coupling between them which isn't harmonically linked, it'll cause stress in one another to reorganize one another until they are. And that means it makes it much easier to build stuff, right? You don't have to build this thing that makes that thing that makes this thing that makes that thing up through those hierarchical levels. You can just have all of that stuff is going on and it will just sort itself out. And all you need to do is sort of nudge it in the right way in order for it to find different shapes and forms, which will automatically do the top-down and bottom-up causal linkages. So what have we got so far from our desiderata for a physical theory of life and mind? We've got direct induction in a suitably impressionable substrate, that if you sing a song to it, you can make things resonate. You've got it embedded and empowered. It's not just a movie, but the swinging pendulum makes the other pendulum swing, which makes the first one swing back again, or passes it on to a third. We've got substrate independence, that song can be held in any substrate, and scale invariance, that it can be sung in a high frequency or a low frequency and still be the same song. And we've got a lot of linkages with biology as we know it, how you could still have a correspondence between genetic evolution over time that looks like it's variation selection at the microscale, but really it's the organism organizing the selective field of that, and a developmental process which seems to be caused by genes upwards, and it partly is, but it's also pushing backwards onto the genes. Okay, what I haven't done yet is explain where songs come from.